The dust was a living thing. It had a taste, a texture, a color that dyed the world in shades of rust and rose. It settled on Eliza Hart's eyelashes and coated the back of her throat. For 3 days. It had been her most constant companion, more present than the door-faced woman sitting opposite her in the rocking, swaying confines of the stagecoach, a woman who clutched a Bible as if she feared the dust itself was a sin. The stagecoach lurched to a halt, its groaning timbers a sound of sweet relief. Outside, the world was a blast of heat and brilliant, unforgiving light. This was Red Creek Station, a place that was less a town and more a scar on the face of the desert, a necessary pause between the vast emptiness behind and the promised settlements ahead. A few sun-bleached buildings huddled together a stable, a trading post whose porch roof sagged like a tired man's shoulders, and a blacksmith's forge from which the rhythmic clang of a hammer rang out. A lonely, defiant heartbeat in the immense silence. The air, thick with heat, carried the sharp tang of horse sweat and the smoky breath of the forge. Eliza stepped down, her black traveling dress instantly filmed with a fresh layer of the ubiquitous red powder. She moved with a deliberate economy that belied her 20 years, her movements practical, not wasteful. She stretched her back, ignoring the stares of the few rough-looking men loitering on the porch. Her gaze swept the area, cataloging, assessing. This was the edge of the world she knew, the beginning of the one she had come to claim. A piece of it, at least. A piece of land to work, a place to put down roots, and a place to begin the search for her brother, James, whose letters had stopped coming a year ago. The silence stretching into a chasm of worry. Her attention was drawn to the man at the forge. He was not the smith, but stood beside him, examining a newly shaped tool, a hoe with a wicked sharp edge. He was Dine, or Navajo, as most of the whites called his people. He was tall for one of his tribe, lean and broad in the shoulders, with hair as black and glossy as a raven's wing tied back with a simple leather thong. He moved with a quiet grace that seemed at odds with the harshness of the landscape. He looked up, and for a moment his eyes met hers across the dusty yard. They were dark, intelligent, and held a stillness that seemed to absorb the frantic glare of the sun. There was no welcome in them, but no hostility either, only a deep, unnerving watchfulness. He was a part of this land, she realized, in a way she and every other person at this station could never be. He belonged to it, like the mesas that stood like solemn gods on the horizon. He turned back to the smith, his conversation a low murmur in a language Eliza did not understand. The driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and whiskey, bellowed for the passengers to reboard. They had 10 minutes to get water and then they were moving on. Eliza went to the well, her own canteen feeling perilously light. As she worked the creaking pump, she felt a presence beside her. It was the Navajo man. He held a water skin, waiting his turn, his posture relaxed but utterly alert. "You travel alone," he said. It was not a question. His voice was low, smoother than she would have expected. Eliza nodded, her eyes on the gush of water filling her canteen. "I do." This is not a land that is kind to those who are alone. She capped her canteen, its cool, damp weight a comfort in her hands. "I am not looking for kindness from the land," she replied, meeting his steady gaze. "Only honesty. I have a deed, properly signed and sealed in Santa Fe." A flicker of something amusement, perhaps, or pity crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Paper burns," he said softly. "A seal melts in the sun. The land does not read." He filled his water skin, the silence stretching between them, thick with the things they did not understand about each other. He was at Sidi Nez, a name he did not offer, a man who guided settlers when he had to and forged tools because the iron obeyed a logic he understood. He worked to protect the boundaries of his people, not the lines drawn on maps in faraway cities, but the ancient markers of stone and memory, the sacred geography that sustained the Dine. He saw in this young woman not an enemy, but a symptom of the sickness that was consuming the territory, this unshakable faith in paper. A faith that gave men like Silas Pike the power to steal the earth and the water itself. She returned to the coach, the man's words echoing in her mind. The journey resumed, the coach wheels churning the red dust into a cloud that followed them like a hungry ghost. The heat intensified. The world outside became a shimmering, hypnotic blur of rock and sand and sky. An hour passed, then another. The road dipped into a wide, shallow arroyo, the air growing still and close, and then they were there. 3 men on horseback, blocking the path. They were not masked, and their confidence was more menacing than any disguise. They carried rifles with a lazy familiarity. The man in the center, a portly fellow with a stained beard, grinned, showing a landscape of missing teeth. "Howdy, folks," he drawled, his eyes lingering on Eliza. "Gonna have to collect the road tax, new county ordinance." The driver paled. "I ain't heard of no road tax." "Well, now you have," the man said, his grin widening. "It's $5 a head, cash only, for the upkeep. You understand." Fear, ripe and sour, filled the coach. The woman with the Bible began to pray in a frantic whisper. Eliza's hand went to the small reticule on her lap, where her money and her precious deed were kept. Her mind raced. This was not a robbery. It was an extortion, wrapped in the thinnest veil of legitimacy. This was the law of money she had heard whispers of, where power simply invented the rules as it went along. Just as the driver was reaching for the company strongbox, another rider appeared. He came not from the road, but from the high side of the arroyo, his horse picking its way down the rocky slope with the sure-footedness of a goat. It was the Navajo man from the station, Atsidi Nez. He did not draw a weapon. He simply sat his horse, a few yards from the 3 men, his stillness a stark contrast to their swaggering energy. The leader of the trio turned, annoyed by the interruption. "This ain't your concern. Friend, ride on." Atsidi did not look at him. His gaze was fixed on a point far down the arroyo. "You are in the wrong place," he said, his voice calm and conversational. "The big silver convoy from the mines at Silver Creek comes through the upper pass. Tomorrow. 100 times what you will get from this coach." The man squinted. "What's that to you?" "Nothing," Atsidi said with a slight shrug. "But a wise man does not waste his time netting minnows when a salmon is ready to leap into his arms. The pass is narrow, easy to block. They will not be expecting you." He gave them a slow, almost conspiratorial smile. "But you will have to be quick. The shortest way from here is through that narrow canyon." He pointed to a dark slit in the rock face 1/4 of a mile away. Eliza watched, holding her breath. It was a performance of breathtaking audacity. He was not threatening them. He was tempting them, appealing to their greed, offering them a bigger prize to make them abandon the smaller one. The leader chewed his lip, his little eyes darting from the coach to the distant canyon, his mind working through the calculations of avarice. "How do we know you ain't lying?" one of his companions asked. Atsidi's smile vanished. He looked at the man, and his eyes were suddenly as hard and cold as river stones in winter. "The people do not lie about such things. It brings disharmony. Now, go. Your greed is making my horse nervous." For a long moment, the tension was a wire stretched to its breaking point. Then, the leader laughed, a short, ugly bark. "All right, boys. Maybe our friend here's right. Let's not waste the day on small change." He wheeled his horse around. "This road's still closed. Though," he snarled at the stagecoach driver, "don't you come back this way." The 3 men galloped off toward the canyon Atsidi had indicated. The passengers in the coach sagged with relief. The driver wiped a sleeve across his sweaty brow, looking at Atsidi with a mixture of fear and awe. "Much obliged, mister," he said. Atsidi only nodded. He dismounted and walked to Eliza's side of the coach. She looked at him, her mind trying to process what she had just seen. He had defeated them with a story. "They will not trouble you again today," he said. "What was in that canyon?" Eliza asked, her voice low. "An old trap," he said. "The spring rains collect there. The ground looks solid, but underneath it is deep clay mud. Their horses will sink to their bellies. It will take them the rest of the day to get out. If they can." She stared at him, a dawning comprehension on her face. The law of the jungle and the law of money. And here was a third way, the law of the land itself, wielded by someone who understood its secrets. She fumbled in her reticule. It was instinct. A service had been rendered. Payment was required. That was how her world worked. She pulled out $2 silver. "This is for your help," she said, holding the coins out to him. He looked at the silver in her palm, then back at her face. He did not move to take it. "I did not do it for you," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "I did it because they are a sickness here. They spoil the harmony." He paused. "And because they work for a man who wants to own the water." He reached for the canteen at his hip, unstoppered it, and offered it to her. "The sun is a liar out here," he said. "It tells you the journey is short. Drink." It was not a request. It was a quiet command. And a test. She hesitated for only a second before taking the canteen. The water was cool and tasted of the earth. Sharing water, she knew, was no small thing in this place. It was a bond, a recognition of shared existence in a land that was indifferent to whether one lived or died. She drank, then handed it back. Their fingers brushed, his skin warm and dry against hers. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt inadequate. He nodded, accepting the canteen and her thanks as his due. As he turned to leave, a faint shout carried on the wind from the direction of the canyon. It was a curse, filled with the fury of a man who has been thoroughly duped. The stagecoach driver chuckled nervously and cracked his whip. The coach began to roll forward. From the distance, another, clearer shout reached them. It was one of the stranded men, his voice thin with rage and exhaustion. "It don't matter. You hear me? Pike's going to buy this whole stream anyway. He'll own it all." The name hung in the air. Pike. It meant nothing to Eliza, a meaningless sound in the vast, arid landscape. The coach picked up speed, leaving the scene behind. Eliza looked back. Atsidi Nez was already mounting his horse, a solitary, unmovable figure against the bleeding red of the setting sun. He had saved her money, perhaps her life. Yet she felt a profound sense of unease. He had shown her that her deed, her precious paper with its official red seal, was a language this land did not speak. Here, survival depended on knowing where the mud was hidden, and true wealth was the taste of cool water offered by a stranger's hand. The town of Esperanza was born of thirst and ambition, a handful of wooden buildings clinging to the banks of a creek that was more sand than water most of the year. It had a land office, a saloon, and a general store whose porch was the town's primary social hub. Eliza Hart's first stop was the office of the man who wore the town's badge, Sheriff Beaumont. He was a large man, his bulk spilling over the sides of a protesting wooden chair. His face was florid, and his eyes, small and shrewd, took in Eliza's dusty but well-made dress and the determined set of her jaw. He examined her deed with a theatrical show of diligence, holding the paper close to his face as if it were scripture. He grunted, then slammed a heavy ink stamp onto the bottom with a satisfying thud. The sound of official business. The sound Eliza had been taught to trust. "All seems to be in order. Miss Hart," he declared, pushing the document back across the scarred wooden desk. "Welcome to Esperanza. That will be $20 for the Settlers' Protection and Civic Harmony fee." Eliza blinked. "I was not aware of such a fee. It was not mentioned in Santa Fe." The sheriff leaned back, his chair groaning in protest. He gave her a paternalistic smile that did not reach his eyes. "Santa Fe is a long way from here. Little lady, out here, we have our own ways of ensuring the peace. Consider it an investment. It guarantees that folks like you, new to the territory, do not have any misunderstandings with the locals keeps things running smooth." His gaze was pointed. Eliza understood his meaning perfectly. The locals he meant were not the shopkeepers or the ranchers. He meant the Dine, whose ancestral lands these were. The $20 was not a fee. It was a payment for selective enforcement of the law. She felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach, but she paid. It was the cost of doing business, a toll on the road to her new life. For now, she would play by these rules. "My land is bordered by a small waterway. According to the survey," she said, carefully folding her deed. "Can you tell me about it?" Beaumont waved a dismissive hand. "Just a seasonal seep. Barely enough to water a horse. The Navajo use it sometimes. But you have the paper. The paper is what matters. They have nothing." His casual erasure of an entire people's history and rights was more chilling than the blatant extortion. Eliza left his office with the stamped deed in her hand, the paper feeling somehow heavier and less certain than it had before. She spent the next 2 days walking the parcel of land that was now hers. It was a sweep of red earth and hardy scrub, cradled by low, sun-baked mesas. It was harsh, but it was honest land. And the sheriff had lied. The waterway was not a mere seasonal seep. It was a slender, constant creek, fed by an underground spring that ran through a shallow ravine along the northern edge of her property. It was a thread of life, greening the banks with cottonwoods and willows. It was a treasure. Following the map that had been filed with her deed, she searched for the surveyor's markers, the physical proof of the lines drawn on the paper. She found the first 3 easily enough iron stakes driven deep into the ground, but the 4th, the one that should have been near the head of the spring, was gone. All that remained was a patch of disturbed earth, as if something had been recently and violently uprooted. That evening, in the small, clean room she had rented above the general store, she spread the map out under the yellow light of an oil lamp. Her trust in its authority was fraying. Thread by thread, she ran her finger along the northern boundary line, the one that followed the precious creek. Her finger stopped at the corner where the marker was missing. There was something odd about the ink there, a slight blurring, a faint discoloration underneath the surveyor's official symbol for an iron stake. She leaned closer, her breath misting the paper. It was not a discoloration, it was a stain, a faint, brownish red stain that had soaked into the very fibers of the document. An old stain. And as she stared, her eyes adjusting to the dim light, she could just make out the ghost of another shape beneath the surveyor's mark, a shape that had been imperfectly erased. It was a small, simple drawing of 3 triangles stacked one on top of the other, like a pyramid of stones. A cold dread, sharp and definite, washed over her. Her brother James had been a surveyor's assistant. He had been meticulous. He would never have filed a map that was smudged or altered. She touched the stain, and a single, terrifying thought bloomed in her mind. It was blood. The next afternoon, as she stood by the spring, staring at the empty space where the 4th marker should have been, a rider approached. It was Atside Inez. He moved with the same quiet purpose she remembered, his horse seeming to flow over the uneven ground. He dismounted, not in a gesture of greeting, but as one who had arrived at his destination. He nodded toward the creek. "This water is for many families," he said. His voice was not accusatory, merely stating a fact as fundamental as the color of the sky. Eliza held up her deed. The paper felt foolish in her hand, a flimsy shield against his certainty. "This paper says the water and the land belong to me." He did not even glance at it. His gaze was on the land itself, reading a different kind of document. "Your paper is new. The trail that follows this water is old. The markers that show the way are older still." "The markers are gone," she said, her voice tight. "There is nothing here." "Because a thief has moved them," he replied calmly. He walked a few paces away from the spring, his eyes scanning the ground. He stopped and pointed. "Here," he said. "Here was the seal." Eliza looked. She saw nothing but rocks and dirt. The what? Seal, he repeated. Stones that speak. A marker built by the hands of our grandfathers to say, here is the path, here is the water. This place is for the people. It was 3 stones, one on top of the other. A promise. The image from the map flashed in her mind, 3 stacked triangles. A promise that had been erased and replaced with a different kind of promise. One sealed with iron and, perhaps, with blood. Her skepticism crumbled, replaced by a frightening clarity. This was the turning point. She could retreat into the false safety of her stamped paper, call the sheriff, and have this man removed from her property. She could cling to the law she understood, or she could step into his world, the world of stone markers and ancient promises, and seek a truth that was not written in ink. The map, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The drawing is on my map, underneath the surveyor's seal. She looked at him, her defenses gone, her uncertainty laid bare. Will you show me the real boundaries? Show me the stones that speak. Atsidi watched her for a long moment. He had come here expecting a fight, another futile argument with another white settler who saw the world only through the small rectangle of a paper deed. He had not expected this. He saw not arrogance in her eyes, but a genuine, desperate need to understand. She was not asking him to yield. She was asking him to teach, and in that, he saw a courage that earned his respect. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. I will show you. For the next hour, they walked. He showed her things she had looked at but never truly seen. A line of stones, half buried in the sand, that marked the edge of an old cornfield, a series of notches cut into a rock face, a calendar that tracked the sun, and finally, hidden in a thicket of saltbush 100 yards from the creek, he showed her the stolen seal. The 3 flat stones lay on the ground, cast aside but not destroyed. The promise had been broken, but the evidence remained. As she knelt, tracing the outline of the stones with her fingers, the truth settled upon her, heavy and cold. Her deed was not just a document, it was a weapon. It was a lie, carefully crafted to steal this water. And the man whose name the would-be robbers had shouted, the man named Pike, was likely the one holding it. Her path was no longer clear. To claim this land as her own would be to participate in the theft. To abandon it would be to give up on her dream and her search for James. They were walking back toward the spring when 2 riders crested the nearby ridge. One of them wore the sheriff's star. It was Beaumont, accompanied by a wiry deputy. They rode down, their horses kicking up dust, and reined in before Eliza and Atsidi. Beaumont's eyes narrowed, taking in the scene, having some trouble. Miss Hart, he asked, his voice dripping with false concern. He pointedly ignored Atsidi. I was clarifying my property lines. Sheriff, Eliza said, her voice steady. Is that a fact? Beaumont said, his gaze hard. Looks to me like you are trespassing on this lady's land. Boy, I think it is time you moved along. He directed this last part to Atsidi. Atsidi met his gaze without flinching. My feet are on the land of my ancestors, he said quietly. It is your shadow that is trespassing here. The sheriff's face darkened. You have a smart mouth. One of these days it is going to get you into a world of trouble. He turned back to Eliza. Ma'am, I will handle this. It is what you pay your fee for. You just stay away from him. He is nothing but a troublemaker. Eliza stood her ground. He was helping me. My survey marker is missing. Beaumont laughed. A harsh, grating sound. Markers go missing all the time. Wind, floods, a wild animal. Do not you worry your pretty head about it. Your paper is all that matters. He looked from her to Atsidi and back again. You seem like a smart young woman. Do not be foolish. Some folks in this territory do not take kindly to fraternization. The threat was clear. He spurred his horse, and the deputy followed. They rode off without a backward glance. The silence they left behind was heavy. Eliza knew then that the law in this town was not a shield for the innocent. It was a club to be used by the powerful. She was caught between a lie she could not accept and a truth she could not enforce. That evening, as she sat listlessly in her room, a knock came at her door. It was a young boy, scrubbed clean and wearing a new-looking shirt. He handed her a thick, cream-colored envelope. Her name was written on it in an elegant, flowing script. Inside was a short, polite note. It acknowledged her recent arrival and the potential for misunderstandings in a new territory. It spoke of shared interests and mutual prosperity. It was an invitation to dine the following evening with the sender, to discuss opportunities that might be of benefit to them both. The note was signed with a confident, powerful flourish. Silas Pike. Esperanza's main street was a river of dust. When a cattle drive passed through, the fine red powder rose in a suffocating cloud, coating every surface and filling the air with the scent of hot animals and dry earth. It was a town of stark contrasts. The joyous, off-key piano music spilling from the saloon doors fought with the solemn peal of the bell from the small, sun-bleached church. The rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer provided a steady beat to the town's chaotic life, a sound of creation and repair amidst the decay. People moved with a purpose born of necessity, their faces etched by sun and worry, yet their eyes still held the glint of hope that had brought them to this harsh frontier. The talk of the town was Silas Pike's Gold Harvest Gala. It was not a gala in the Eastern sense, but an open invitation to every soul in the county for free food, drink, and music. Banners, crudely painted but cheerful, were strung across the street. Pike was selling more than just land. He was selling a dream, and he knew that a full belly and a cup of whiskey were the best ways to open a man's heart and his wallet. Eliza had accepted Pike's invitation, not out of politeness, but out of a cold, calculated curiosity. She needed to know the man who moved survey markers and employed thugs to collect non-existent taxes. She needed to look into the eyes of the man whose name had been whispered by the man at Seedy had tricked. The gala was held in the dusty expanse between the saloon and the livery stable. Long trestle tables groaned under the weight of roasted beef, beans, and cornbread. A pair of fiddlers sawed away at a lively tune, their music an energetic but thin thread in the vastness of the evening. The crowd was a collection of hopefuls' families with too many children and not enough acres. Young men with calloused hands and a hunger for a future they could build themselves, and a scattering of prospectors whose dreams of gold had long since faded into the grit of reality. Silas Pike moved through the crowd like a beloved preacher. He was a handsome man in his 40s, with a confident smile, a hearty laugh, and eyes that seemed to see and affirm the deepest desires of whomever they landed upon. He dressed in fine but practical clothes, presenting himself not as a distant landowner, but as a fellow pioneer, the first among equals. "Friends, neighbors," he called out, his voice booming with practiced sincerity as he stepped onto a makeshift stage. "Welcome tonight. We do not talk of hardship. We celebrate the harvest, the bounty of this good, strong land, and the even greater bounty that is yet to come." He spoke of prosperity, of communities built on hard work and shared values. He spoke of the railroad coming, of new markets, of a golden future for Esperanza. He painted a picture so vivid, so enticing, that the dust and the heat and the constant struggle seemed to melt away. Then, he gestured toward the sheriff's office, where a newly posted notice was tacked to the door. "And thanks to our forward-thinking Sheriff Beaumont, we now have the new legal homesteading order, a clear and simple path for every one of you to claim your piece of this great territory. No more confusion, no more uncertainty, just honest work for honest land." Eliza saw it for what it was, a legal framework for theft, a document that would sanctify the removal of the Dine from the lands they had occupied for centuries. Pike, sensing he had the crowd in the palm of his hand, held up a sample contract. "I know some of you are cautious. You have heard stories of bad deals and crooked agents, and you are right to be careful. That is why I believe in transparency. This is my standard agreement, simple, fair, and ironclad, a promise on paper, backed by the law." A few men in the crowd nodded, their faces earnest. This was the language they trusted, the language of contracts and laws, the bedrock of the world they had left behind. Eliza felt a surge of cold anger. She saw the faces of the hopeful families, and she saw the lie being sold to them. Before she could stop herself, she stepped forward. "Mr. Pike," she called out, her voice clear and steady. "May I see that document?" A hush fell over the crowd. Heads turned. Silas Pike looked down at her, his smile tightening almost imperceptibly. He could not refuse without looking like he had something to hide. "Of course, my dear lady," he said, his tone magnanimous. "A woman of letters. I admire that." He handed down the contract. Eliza took it, the paper crisp and official in her hands. She read it quickly, her practical mind cutting through the dense legal language. The fiddlers had stopped playing. The only sound was the low murmur of the crowd. "This is a well-drafted document. Mr. Pike," she began, her voice carrying in the still air. "It covers many things: the price per acre, the payment schedule, the timber and mineral rights." She paused, looking up at the crowd. "In fact, it is so thorough. It seems to cover things one might not expect to be for sale." Pike's smile was fixed. "We believe in thoroughness, Miss Hart." "I see that," she said, a small, wry smile touching her own lips. "For example, Article 7, Section B. It grants the purchaser exclusive rights to all surface and subterranean water sources, which is standard, but it also includes rights to, and I am quoting here, all precipitation, rain, snow, or hail that may fall upon said property." She looked at the faces staring back at her, a mix of confusion and dawning amusement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this contract sells the rain." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd, starting as a chuckle and growing into a hearty roar. For the first time that evening, the tension in the air broke. These were people who understood the absurdity of owning the rain. It was a gift from God, or from the sky. It was not something a man, not even Silas Pike, could sell. Pike's face was a mask of strained composure. Eliza was not finished. "And the humor does not stop there," she continued, her tone becoming more serious. "Article 9 states that if a single payment is late by so much as 1 day, for any reason, a storm, a sickness, a broken wagon wheel, the purchaser forfeits the land and all improvements made upon it. There are no exceptions. You could build a house, dig a well, and plant your fields for a year, but if you are 1 day late with one payment, you lose everything. You lose your home, your work, your hope. You are left with nothing but the dust on your boots." The laughter died. The faces of the settlers were now grim. They understood that language too, the language of ruin. Eliza folded the contract neatly and handed it back to a stunned man at the front of the crowd to pass up to the stage. "Thank you for your transparency, Mr. Pike," she said, her voice ringing with irony. "It has been most educational." She turned and walked away from the stage, the crowd parting for her. She had not raised her voice, had not made a single accusation, but she had shattered Pike's carefully constructed illusion. She had used his own weapon, his trusted paper and ink, against him. She saw Sheriff Beaumont near the saloon, his face a thundercloud. He made a move toward her, but a rancher, a man whose property bordered her own, stepped in his way to ask a question, and the moment was lost. Eliza walked toward the blessed darkness away from the lanterns of the gala, her heart pounding. She found herself near the blacksmith's forge, the air still holding the residual heat of the day's work. A figure detached itself from the shadows. It was Atsidi Nez. He had been watching, a silent observer on the edge of the firelight. "You have a sharp tongue," he said. It was not a compliment, but a statement of fact. It cuts deeper than a knife. "Lies are like weeds," Eliza answered, her breathing slowly returning to normal. "If you do not pull them up by the roots, they will choke everything." "You have not pulled the root," he said. "You have only trimmed the leaves. The root is Pike, and he is watered by men like Beaumont. He looked at her, his dark eyes serious in the flickering light. He will not forget what you did tonight. Be careful whose water you drink. His warning was practical, direct, a reflection of the world he knew, where a shared canteen was a pact and a poisoned well was a real and present danger. It was the counsel of an ally, a person who saw the same threat she did. "I will," she said, and in that moment, a bond was forged between them, unspoken and unadorned, solid as the anvil that stood beside them. Needing to be away from the lingering tension of the gala, Eliza stepped into the saloon. It was crowded and noisy, a refuge for those who preferred their whiskey without a side of legal debate. She made her way to the bar to get a glass of water. A man standing nearby, his clothes smudged with grease and his words slurred by drink, turned to her. "That was quite a show you put on out there. Missy," he said, leaning conspiratorially. "Good for you. Pike ain't the saint he makes himself out to be, not by a long shot." Eliza simply nodded, not wanting to encourage him, but the man was determined to talk. "I used to work for him, on one of his survey crews. He pays well at first, but he works a man to the bone and dumps him when he is done." He took a long swallow of his drink. "We had this one fella on our crew last year. A good kid, quiet, did all the paperwork, neat as a pin. Then one day, he just vanished. Pike said he ran off, stole some equipment. He claimed, but none of us believed it. The kid wasn't the type." A cold stillness spread through Eliza's limbs. "What was his name?" she asked, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. The man scratched his beard, thinking, something simple, English name. "Oh, I remember now. It was Hart, James Hart." The name struck Eliza with the force of a physical blow. James, her brother. The saloon noise faded to a dull roar in her ears. The smudged map, the missing marker, the faint brown stain that looked so much like old blood. Everything clicked into place, forming a picture of such profound and personal horror that she felt the floor might give way beneath her. She had come west seeking a piece of land and a lost brother. She now had a sickening feeling that she had found them both in the same grave. The man who had sold her a fraudulent deed was the last person to see her brother alive, and he had invited her to dinner. The knowledge of what had likely happened to her brother was a cold stone in Eliza's gut. It did not melt away with the morning sun. It sat there, heavy and permanent, coloring every thought, tainting every interaction. She moved through the next few days in a state of heightened awareness. The ordinary sounds of Esperanza, the laughter from the saloon, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer seeming distant and unreal. The world had split into two parts, the sunlit surface where people lived and dreamed, and the dark, silent earth where her brother might lie. Silas Pike had not followed up on his dinner invitation, and Eliza knew why. Her public dismantling of his contract had been a declaration of war. He was now waiting, watching, letting the town's own pressures work on her. The harvest festival arrived, a day meant to celebrate the meager bounty wrested from the unforgiving land. It was a mandatory celebration, a performance of community and hope that felt profoundly false to Eliza. The main street was cleared of wagons, and tables were set up. There was music from the same tireless fiddlers, and the smell of roasting meat once again filled the air. But underlying the festivity was a current of tension, and Eliza knew she was at its center. People watched her. The women whispered behind their hands, their gazes a mixture of pity and condemnation. The men looked at her with a new, unwelcome possessiveness, as if she were a stray filly that needed to be brought into the town's corral. She had made herself a problem. A woman alone. A woman with a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue. A woman who did not seem to be in any hurry to find a husband and settle into her proper place. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip toward the mesas, painting the sky in fiery strokes, when Sheriff Beaumont, his face flushed with importance and whiskey, climbed onto the back of a wagon. "All right, folks, settle down, he boomed. his voice carrying over the music. "It is time for a little harvest fun. A town tradition." He grinned, a predator's smile. "We have got a new and unattached lady in our midst. A true desert rose." He gestured dramatically toward Eliza, who felt 100 pairs of eyes land on her like a physical weight. "And it is high time we made her feel welcome in the proper Esperanza fashion. So, we are going to have the annual harvest proposal, all you fine, upstanding bachelors. Form a line. The prize is a dance with the lovely Miss Hart." A wave of boisterous masculine laughter and cheers went up. It was a trap, and it had just been sprung. This was her punishment, dressed up as a game, a public ritual designed to humiliate her, to reduce her from a thinking, acting individual into a prize to be won, a piece of property to be claimed. To refuse would be to brand herself as arrogant and ungrateful, cementing her status as an outsider. To participate would be to submit, to play their degrading game by their rules. A line began to form. Eliza watched, her heart a cold, steady drum against her ribs. 13 men. There was young Billy from the general store, barely 18, his face red with a mixture of excitement and terror. There was Mr. Abernathy, the grim-faced widower who ran the land office, a man who looked as though he had not smiled since his wife's passing. There were ranch hands, a drifter who had been in town for a week, and the blacksmith's lanky apprentice. 13 suitors, a cross-section of the town's available men, lined up to claim her. Silas Pike stood on the porch of the saloon, a glass of whiskey in his hand, watching the spectacle with a look of immense satisfaction. This was his doing. He was reasserting the town's order, his order, using the blunt instrument of social pressure. Eliza took a slow breath. The dust, the noise, the expectant faces all seemed to recede. She would not refuse, but she would not submit. She would walk the line they had drawn for her, but she would choose her own destination. The fiddles struck up a lively tune. The crowd clapped along, their face eager for the show. Sheriff Beaumont gestured for her to begin. She started with young Billy. He gulped, his Adam's apple bobbing, and stammered out a clumsy, rehearsed proposal for a dance. Eliza looked at him, not with contempt, but with a flicker of compassion for his youth and his embarrassment. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a gesture of gentle refusal, and walked on. Next was the widower, Mr. Abernathy. He simply stared at her, his proposal a silent, desperate plea for an end to his loneliness. She saw the grief that still clung to him like a shroud. She paused, inclined her head in a gesture of respect for his loss, and moved on. She walked past a swaggering cowboy who winked at her, his confidence in offensive armor. She walked past a nervous farmer who twisted his hat in his hands, his eyes fixed on the ground. She walked past each of them, her silence a more powerful response than any words she could have spoken. With every step, the crowd grew quieter. The clapping faltered, then stopped. The fiddlers, sensing the shift in the mood, played with less enthusiasm, the tune eventually dissolving into a few uncertain notes before they too fell silent. The event was no longer a game. It was a quiet, relentless act of defiance. 13 suitors lined up, a wall of masculine expectation, and the woman they sought to claim walked past all of them, her simple black dress a stark contrast to the festive colors of the day. The town held its breath, watching. Eliza's gaze swept the edges of the crowd, and she saw him. Atsidi Nez stood near the shadows of the livery stable, away from the main throng, a still point in the swirling chaos. He was not a part of their celebration, not a part of their world. He was simply watching, his face impassive, his presence a silent testament to a different reality, a different law. He was the land itself, observing the foolish games of the newcomers. Her path became clear. She walked past the last man in the line, a burly miner whose surprise was comical, and did not stop. She walked away from the center of the street, away from the silent suitors and the stunned crowd. She walked toward the shadows where Atsidi stood. She stopped directly in front of him. He did not move, did not speak. His dark eyes held hers, and in them she saw not surprise, but a deep, quiet understanding. He had seen what she was doing. He had understood. Slowly, deliberately. Eliza raised her hand. It was a gesture of immense trust, an offering in a world that had shown her little reason to trust anyone. She held it out to him, and in the dead silence of a town that had forgotten to breathe, she took the Navajo warrior's hand. His hand was warm and strong, his grip firm but gentle. It was not the hand of a suitor, but the hand of an ally. A shock went through the crowd, a collective gasp of disbelief and outrage. Sheriff Beaumont found his voice first. "What in God's name do you think you are doing? Woman!" he roared, his face purple with fury. "Have you lost your senses choosing that savage over good, decent white men? It is an insult, an abomination." But his words had lost their power. The ritual had been broken, its authority shattered. Silas Pike, still on the saloon porch, did not look angry. He smiled. It was a thin, cold smile of a man who has just been presented with a new, sharper weapon. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes glinting with a cold, calculating light. The crowd began to murmur, the shock giving way to a volatile mix of anger, confusion, and for a few, a grudging, secret admiration. On the edge of the crowd, two hard-faced men, strangers with guns on their hips, exchanged a look. They had been watching the proceedings with the detached air of professionals, and now they seemed to have found a new focus for their attention. Atsidi did not release her hand. He did not look at the sheriff or the crowd. He looked at Eliza, and then he began to move, drawing her with him. He led her away from the center of the spectacle, away from the accusing stares and the rising tide of anger. They moved together, their steps synchronized, a slow, deliberate retreat from the madness. There was no music, but there was a rhythm to their movement, a silent dance whose tempo was the steady, reassuring beat of their own hearts. It was a dance of shared purpose, a public declaration of an alliance that defied every rule of this broken, grasping world. They walked to the far end of the street, where the last light of the sun was gilding the dust in the air, the sounds of the festival, already resuming with a strained, ugly energy, began to fade behind them. They stopped in the quiet space behind the church, the adobe walls still radiating the day's warmth. He finally released her hand, though the feeling of his touch lingered. "You have made a fire," he said, his voice low. "Now everyone will want to see what burns." "Sometimes you have to make a fire to see in the dark," she replied, her own voice trembling slightly now that the ordeal was over. A figure emerged from the alley beside the church, scurrying toward them with a worried, backward glance. It was the drunken surveyor she had spoken to in the saloon, but he was sober now, his eyes wide with fear. "Miss Hart," he whispered, his voice raspy, I should not be talking to you, not after that, but my conscience won't let me be." "What is it?" Eliza asked, a new dread gripping her. "After you talked to me the other night, I started asking around, quiet like, about your brother, about what happened to him." He wrung his hands, his gaze darting nervously into the growing darkness. "Pike's got an old copper mine, north of here, up in the mesas. He bought it cheap a year ago, said he was going to reopen it, around the same time James went missing. There was a cave-in at that mine, a bad one. Pike sealed the tunnel, said it was too unstable, brought in a whole load of timber, shored it up and blocked it off for good." The man looked at her, his face pale in the twilight. He never reported no one missing from the cave-in, but he bought an awful lot of timber for a mine he was abandoning, enough to wall up a tomb. The words settled into the quiet air. A tomb. The cold stone in Eliza's gut became a shard of ice. Her brother was not just missing. He was buried, entombed in the dark, silent earth, in a copper mine owned by Silas Pike. And she now knew with a certainty that was as absolute and terrifying as death itself, that she would have to go into that darkness to find him. The surveyor's words hung in the cold night air, an epitaph spoken into the darkness, a tomb. Eliza felt the world tilt, the ground unsteady beneath her feet. The festive sounds from the main street were a grotesque mockery, the music of a town dancing on her brother's grave. She looked at Atsidi, and in the deep stillness of his eyes, she saw her own horror reflected. He had heard, he understood. There was no discussion, no debate. The decision was made in the silent space between one breath and the next. She had to go to the mine. She had to know. His patrols watch the main trails, Atsidi said, his voice a low anchor in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. Pike's men, they will be watching you now more than ever. I do not care, she said, her voice hard with a grief too new and too sharp for tears. I will walk there in broad daylight if I have to. And you will be dead before you reach the foothills, he replied. Not unkindly, that is not the way. There are other paths, older paths. We will go when the moon is high. Stay off the flatlands and in the shadow of the mesas. The land will hide us. It was not an offer, but a statement of fact. He was going with her. The thought of facing the darkness of that mine alone was a terror she had not yet allowed herself to contemplate. His presence was a small, solid point of warmth in the encroaching ice. They separated without another word. Eliza returned to her small room, not to sleep, but to prepare. She changed out of her dress and into a sturdy riding skirt and a plain, dark blouse. She packed a small satchel with a canteen of water, a piece of dried beef, and the tinder box. Every movement was precise, automatic. Her mind was a fortress, walled off against the flood of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. There would be time for grief later. Now was the time for action. 2 hours past midnight, when Esperanza was a collection of silent, sleeping shapes under a dome of impossibly bright stars. She slipped out of the back of the general store. Atsidi was waiting, a shadow among shadows, with 2 horses. He had chosen a sturdy mare for her, and he helped her mount with a silent efficiency that spoke of long practice. They rode out of town not toward the north, where the mine lay, but to the west, away from the prying eyes that might still be watching. Only when the last flicker of Esperanza's lamps was swallowed by the immense darkness did Atsidi turn them north, into the broken country of the mesas. The world at night was a landscape of silver and black. The red earth was transformed into a soft, luminous gray under the moonlight. The great rock formations stood like ancient, sleeping beasts, their long shadows stretching out like grasping arms. There was no trail. Not one that Eliza could see, but Atsidi moved with an unerring confidence. He read the subtle shifts in the terrain, the placement of the stars, the very feel of the air. He was a part of this nocturnal world, as at home in it as she was in a library. They rode in silence. The only sounds the soft fall of their horses' hooves on the sandy ground and the whisper of the cool night wind. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the weight of their purpose, with the grief that was a living thing inside Eliza's chest. She thought of James, of his neat handwriting and his quiet, earnest way of explaining things. Had he ridden this same path under this same moon, filled with the hope of a new life, only to find a tomb at the end of it, sometime before dawn? Atsidi led them into a narrow, winding canyon, the rock walls rising up on either side to blot out the stars. He dismounted in front of a dark opening in the cliff face, a shallow cave carved by wind and water over 1,000 years. We will rest here until the next dark, he said. The horses need water. He led them deeper into the cave, to a place where a tiny, clear spring seeped from the rock, gathering in a natural stone basin. This was an ancestral place, a hidden sanctuary of life in the midst of the stone desert. The air was cool and still. After the horses had drunk their fill, Atsidi and Eliza sat on a smooth rock ledge near the entrance. The journey had been arduous, a constant strain of watchfulness and physical exertion. Eliza was weary to her bones, but sleep felt a universe away. Atsidi took out his water skin. It was the same one he had offered her on the day of the ambush. He drank, then passed it to her. "There is not much left," he said. "We will have to make it last." She took it, her fingers brushing his. She drank sparingly, the water a shock of cold life in her throat. Sharing the last of the water was an act of profound intimacy, a quiet acknowledgement of their shared fate in this vast, indifferent land. They were tied together now, partners in a dangerous quest. She handed the water skin back to him. "I used to think the world was an orderly place," she said, her voice quiet in the echoing stillness of the cave. "I believed in contracts, in the power of a signature and a seal. I thought if you followed the rules, you would be safe." Atsidi was silent for a long moment, staring out at the sliver of star-dusted sky visible from the cave's mouth. "My grandfather taught me to read the rules of the land," he said, his voice a low murmur. "He said the sky is the first contract. It promises the sun, and it promises the rain. The earth is the second. It promises to feed us if we care for it. These are the only rules that do not change." "My brother believed in the rules of paper," Eliza said, the words a painful whisper. "He was a good man. He was honest." "Honesty is not a shield against a man who has no honor," Atsidi said. They sat in a comfortable silence, the shared understanding between them a fragile bridge across the chasm of their different worlds, to fill the quiet, to push back the darkness that threatened to consume her. Eliza found herself speaking of her childhood, of running through green fields in Ohio with James, of the silly, serious promises they had made to always look out for each other. Atsidi listened, his stillness an invitation to speak. When she was done, he told her of his own youth, of learning the songs of his people, songs that were maps of the land, filled with stories of the gods who had shaped the mesas and canyons. He spoke not of ownership, but of kinship with the earth, of the responsibility the Dine felt for the well-being of the land that sustained them. That day, at the festival, Eliza said, the memory still a fresh, stinging wound. When they made that line, it was not about me. It was about my land, my water. They were trying to make me a piece of property, just another clause in a contract. I think that is what I fear the most. Not being alone, but being owned. Atsidi looked at her, and the impassive mask he so often wore was gone. In his eyes, she saw a flicker of the same fire that burned in her own heart. "Among the people," he said, "a person is a sacred path. To love someone is to walk beside them, to help them clear the stones from their way. It is not to build a fence around them. A man who wants to own a woman is a man who fears her strength. Pike fears your strength. That is why he tried to put you in a cage of ridicule." His words were a balm on her raw spirit. He understood. He saw her not as a problem to be solved or a prize to be won, but as a person walking her own path. As he spoke, a change began in the air outside. The whisper of the wind at the mouth of the cave grew into a low moan. Then, a rising howl. A gust of sand and grit swirled into their sanctuary. Atsidi rose and went to the entrance, peering out into the pre-dawn gloom. "A storm," he said, his voice tight. "A strong one. We are safe here, but it will be a rough ride." The wind shrieked, a wild, elemental fury. The world outside the cave dissolved into a roaring, blinding chaos of sand. The temperature plummeted, the desert night turning instantly, bitingly cold. The horses huddled deeper in the cave, their nervous whinnies barely audible over the storm's roar. Eliza wrapped her arms around herself, but the cold seeped into her bones, a deep, invasive chill. She began to shiver, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. Atsidi came and sat beside her on the ledge, his back to the cave wall. He was a solid, unmoving presence in the midst of the storm's violence. He looked at her shivering form. Without a word, he moved closer and put an arm around her, drawing her against his side. It was not a gesture of romance, but of pure, practical necessity. His body was a shield against the cold, a source of warmth in the maelstrom. She leaned into him, her shivering slowly subsiding as his heat soaked into her. They sat like that for a long time, listening to the symphony of the storm. Two small, fragile beings huddled together against the immense, impersonal power of nature. "If I am shivering," she murmured after a while, her voice muffled against his shoulder, "it is the wind." She felt, more than heard, the low chuckle in his chest. "The wind," he answered, his voice a warm vibration against her ear, "is laughing." The storm raged for what felt like an eternity, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it passed. The wind died down to a whisper, and a profound silence fell over the land. A pale, ethereal light began to filter into the sky. It was dawn. They emerged from the cave into a world remade. The landscape was scoured, reshaped by the wind. The air was clean and sharp and cold. The rising sun cast long, dramatic shadows from the mesas. Atsidi's eyes were scanning the ground, which had been swept clean of its loose topsoil by the wind. His body went still. He walked forward a few paces and knelt. "Here," he said, his voice taut with discovery. Eliza went to his side. The storm had uncovered what had been deliberately hidden. There, half buried in the newly exposed earth, was a deep, straight hole, and beside it, lying on its side as if it had been cast away in anger, was a flat, triangular stone. It was one of the seal, one of the ancient markers. It had been violently uprooted from its rightful place. And that was not all. The wind had also revealed something else, something the sand had hidden for months. Leading away from the uprooted marker, heading directly north toward the distant hills where the mine lay hidden, were the faint, unmistakable ruts of a heavily laden wagon. The tracks were deep, dug into the harder earth beneath the sand. The signature of a wagon hauling a great weight, the weight of timbers. Eliza knew. Enough timbers to wall up a tomb. The story was no longer a drunken whisper in a saloon. It was written here, on the face of the land, for anyone who knew how to read it. The wagon tracks were a map of betrayal, a clear, straight path leading from the desecrated ancestral marker to the hills that bled copper. Eliza and Atsidi followed them, the early morning sun at their backs casting their long shadows before them like heralds of a coming judgment. The landscape grew harsher, the hardy desert scrub giving way to stony ground littered with the refuse of past mining attempts. Slag heaps rose like unnatural gray tumors from the red earth, and the skeletal remains of old wooden structures stood silhouetted against the sky. This was a place where the land had not been cared for, but torn open, its treasures ripped out and its wounds left to fester. The mine was a dark gash in the side of a low mesa. It was not a grand operation, but a small, desperate-looking hole, its entrance framed by a structure of heavy timbers. What struck Eliza immediately was the newness of some of the wood. Thick, raw beams had been used to construct a solid wall of lumber just inside the mine's mouth, sealing it shut. It was exactly as the drunken surveyor had described, a tomb hastily and crudely walled off from the world. Atsidi dismounted, his movements economical and silent. He approached the entrance cautiously, his hand resting lightly on the new timbers, his eyes scanning the surrounding area for any sign of a recent presence. He sniffed the air that seeped from the cracks in the wooden wall. "The air is bad," he said, his voice low. "It tastes of stale breath and wet rock, a place of no life." Grief, cold and sharp, pierced the fortress of Eliza's resolve. This was it, the end of her brother's road. She slid from her horse, her legs unsteady. "We have to get inside," she said, her voice a raw whisper. "I have to know." Atsidi examined the barricade. It was solid, meant to withstand pressure from within. Not without, but near the bottom. A few planks had been wedged in place less securely. With a pry bar from his saddle roll, he began to work, his movements patient and powerful. The wood groaned in protest, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound silence of the hills. After several minutes of strenuous effort, a narrow opening was created. just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The darkness beyond was absolute. A chill, foul-smelling air washed over them, a breath from the deep earth. Atsidi lit the lantern he had brought, its yellow flame pushing back the oppressive gloom to reveal a narrow, decaying tunnel. The original support beams were slick with moisture and fuzzy with a pale, unhealthy-looking fungus. Water dripped from the ceiling, each drop echoing in the close confines. Atsidi went first, holding the lantern high. Eliza followed, her hand resting on the small pistol she had tucked into her waistband, though she knew it would be of little use against the ghosts that haunted this place. They moved slowly, their boots squelching in the muddy soil of the tunnel floor. The air grew heavier with each step, thick with the smell of damp earth, rotting wood, and something else. A faint, metallic sourness that caught in the back of her throat. About 100 feet in, the tunnel ended abruptly in a chaotic wall of fallen rock and splintered timbers. The cave-in, it was a solid, impassable barrier, a mountain of rubble that sealed the deeper passages of the mine forever. Eliza's eyes scanned the wreckage, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. This was the place. James was somewhere behind that wall of stone. Her gaze fell upon a single point of white amidst the grimy brown and gray of the debris. It was a small piece of cloth, snagged on a sharp splinter of a broken support beam. She reached for it, her fingers trembling. It was a man's handkerchief, made of fine linen, now stained with mud and mildew, and in the corner, stitched with a neat, precise hand, was a single, elegant letter. H. She closed her eyes, clutching the small square of fabric. It was her mother's stitch work. She had given a set of these to James when he left for the West. A sob, dry and ragged, escaped her throat. It was the only proof she would ever have, a final, heartbreaking message from the darkness. As she struggled to regain her composure, Atsidi, who had been examining the edges of the rock fall, let out a low grunt. "Here," he said, holding the lantern closer to the ground. Partially buried in the mud near the wall was a thick, leather-bound book. He worked it free and handed it to Eliza. It was a miner's shift log. She opened it, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the damp, stiff pages. The entries were written in a familiar, meticulous script, her brother's handwriting. It was a record of the men who worked here, the hours they toiled, the amount of ore they extracted. It was a document of life, of labor, of sweat and effort, lying here at the very edge of death. And it was the last thing James had ever written. A wave of guilt washed over her, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She had put her faith in a deed, in a piece of paper that told a lie. This book, this humble record of honest work, was the truth that had been buried along with her brother. A sound from the mouth of the tunnel made them both freeze. It was the distinct scrape of boots on rock, followed by the low murmur of voices. They were no longer alone. Atsidi instantly extinguished the lantern, plunging them into a thick, disorienting blackness. He pulled Eliza back, into a small alcove just a few feet from the entrance. The voices grew louder. One was the oily, self-assured baritone of Silas Pike. The other was the gruff, blustering tone of Sheriff Beaumont. "I told you it was a mistake leaving the hole," Beaumont was saying. "We should have filled the whole thing in." "An unnecessary expense," Pike's voice replied, cool and dismissive, "and it would have raised questions. This barricade is sufficient. No one is coming up here." "Someone did," Beaumont grumbled. "Look, the planks have been moved." There was a moment of silence. Eliza could hear her own heart thundering in her ears. She clutched the logbook to her chest. "It seems Miss Hart is more resourceful than I gave her credit for," Pike said, and there was a note of cold amusement in his voice. "A foolish, sentimental girl. It seems we will have to clean up this loose end after all. Bring the crate." Eliza heard the sound of a heavy wooden box being dragged across the ground. Then, a sharp, metallic click, followed by the unmistakable hiss of a lit fuse. This will solve the problem permanently, Pike said. A second. Tragic cave-in. The mine was known to be unstable. Beaumont. You will find their horses later and express my deepest condolences to the town. Such a terrible accident. They were going to blow the entrance, entombing Eliza and Atsidi along with the truth. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Eliza. They were trapped, but Atsidi was calm. His hand found hers in the darkness. A brief, reassuring squeeze. He put his mouth close to her ear. "Stay here," he whispered. He moved away from her, a phantom in the blackness. She heard a faint metallic sound, then a soft scraping. The hissing of the fuse was a terrifying countdown. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Just as she was sure the world was about to end in a roar of fire and rock, she heard a sharp, final snip. And then, silence. Atsidi was beside her again. "The fuse is cut," he breathed. "I have a tool. From the forge." But their relief was short-lived. From deeper within the mine, from the very edge of the rock fall, came a low moan. It was a sound of human misery. "There is someone else here," Eliza whispered, her blood running cold. Atsidi relit the lantern. Its sudden glare was blinding. In its light, they saw what they had missed before. Pinned beneath a massive rock near the edge of the collapse was a man. He was alive, barely. His face was pale and gaunt, his leg trapped and horribly twisted. Just as they reached him, they heard a furious shout from outside. The fuse went out. Get another one. They had moments. The man looked at them, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and hope. "Help me!" he rasped. Atsidi examined the rock. It was immense, too heavy to lift. "We cannot move it," he said. Eliza's practical mind took over, cutting through the fear. "We do not have to lift it," she said, her eyes scanning the debris. "We just have to shift it." She pointed to a long, thick support beam lying nearby, a lever. Together, they wrestled the heavy timber into position, wedging one end under the great rock and using a smaller stone as a fulcrum. It was a desperate, primal struggle against time and physics. They put all their weight on the end of the beam. The wood groaned. The rock shifted. Just an inch. Then another. The trapped miner cried out, a sound of pain and relief, and pulled his shattered leg free. Now Atsidi yelled. They helped the injured man to his feet, supporting his weight between them, and half-dragged, half-carried him toward the narrow opening in the barricade. They scrambled through just as Pike and Beaumont were approaching with a second stick of dynamite. The sight of them emerging from the tomb, supporting an injured man, struck the two villains dumb with shock. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the injured man cried out, "Emma!" A small girl, no more than 10 years old, was running toward them from the direction of the town. She had a basket in her hand and a look of worry on her face. It was the miner's daughter, come to bring him his lunch, unaware of the horror that had unfolded. Pike recovered first. His plan was in ruins. He had witnesses, and he had evidence against him. He needed a new plan, a new weapon. He saw it in the form of the approaching child. As the miner, whose name was Thomas, hobbled toward his daughter, a look of pure joy on his face, Pike moved with a startling speed. He lunged past Eliza and Atsidi, grabbing the little girl and pulling her back against him. He drew a pistol and pressed its muzzle to her head. "Nobody move," he snarled, his mask of civility gone, revealing the ruthless monster beneath. "Drop the book, Miss Hart, or the girl dies." Eliza froze, the heavy logbook in one hand, the mud-stained handkerchief of her dead brother clutched in the other. They had escaped the tomb. They had found a witness. They had the proof they needed to destroy Silas Pike. But he held the life of an innocent child in his hand, and in that terrible, silent standoff, under the harsh, unforgiving sun, Eliza knew that the price of justice had just become impossibly high. The world exploded into motion. Before Pike could tighten his grip, before Beaumont could even register the shift in power, Atsidi moved. He was not a brawler. He was a warrior. And his actions were swift, precise, and utterly without waste. He scooped a heavy, sharp-edged rock from the ground and threw it with a flick of his wrist. It was not aimed to kill, but to disarm. The rock struck Pike's gun hand with a sickening crack of bone on metal. The pistol clattered to the ground. In the same instant, Pike howled in pain and his grip on Emma loosened. It was the only opening they would get. Thomas, ignoring the fire in his own shattered leg, lunged forward, not at Pike, but at his daughter, pulling her away from the danger. Eliza grabbed the fallen pistol, its metal still warm, and snatched the dynamite from Beaumont's stunned hand. It was over in 2 heartbeats. Pike clutched his broken hand, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent rage. Beaumont, disarmed and outmaneuvered, stood frozen. His authority vanished. "This is not over," Pike hissed, cradling his injury. "You will both be hunted down like dogs." He and Beaumont backed away, then turned and scrambled onto their horses, riding hard for the relative safety of the town they owned. There was no time to think, no time to grieve. They were exposed, carrying evidence that could get them killed. The injured Thomas, leaning heavily on Eliza, looked at his daughter, his face a mess of terror and relief. "We cannot stay here," Atsidi said, his voice urgent. He was already retrieving their horses. "He will send his men, the ones with guns for hire." "We cannot run," Eliza countered, her mind racing. She clutched the heavy logbook to her chest like a shield. "If we run, he wins. He buries the truth forever. We have to tell the story, now, before he can tell his version." "No one will listen," Thomas rasped, his face pale with pain. "Beaumont is the law." "Then we will make a new court," Eliza declared, a wild, desperate resolve hardening her voice. "A court under the open sky, with the people as the jury." She looked at Atsidi, her eyes blazing. "The church, it is the one place in that town he does not completely own." Their ride back to Esperanza was a frantic, painful race against time. Atsidi led them on a winding path through the arroyos, avoiding the main trails. Thomas, his face gray and beaded with sweat, stifled his moans, his focus entirely on his daughter, Emma, who rode before Eliza, her small body trembling. They reached the edge of town as the sun was reaching its zenith, beating down with a merciless intensity. They did not go to the sheriff's office or the saloon. They rode directly to the small adobe church that stood in the center of the dusty square, its simple wooden cross a stark silhouette against the brilliant blue sky. The Reverend Miller, a thin, gentle man with kind, worried eyes, came out onto the church steps as they dismounted. He looked at the injured Thomas, the frightened child, the grim-faced Navajo warrior, and the young woman whose eyes held a fire he had never seen before. "Miss Hart," he began, his voice filled with concern. "What has happened?" "A crime has been committed, Reverend," Eliza said, her voice ringing with a strange, formal clarity. "And we have come to seek justice, not from the law of Sheriff Beaumont, but from the law of God and the conscience of this town. Will you let us use your house to speak the truth?" The Reverend hesitated for only a moment, then gave a solemn nod. "The house of God is a house of truth," he said. Atsidi, without a word, took the rope from the church bell and began to pull. The bell's clear, urgent toll, usually reserved for Sunday services or dire emergencies, rang out over the town. Windows and doors opened. People emerged, their faces questioning, drawn by the summons. They set their stage in the dusty patch of ground before the church doors. It was a courtroom of desperation. Eliza propped a makeshift easel and hung the surveyor's map, the one with a faint bloodstain, for all to see. Atsidi, with a quiet reverence, placed the heavy, triangular stone marker from his ancestors on the ground before it, a piece of the true, ancient law of the land. Thomas, his leg roughly splinted, was helped to a seat on the church steps, his daughter Emma sitting close beside him, her small hand never leaving his. A crowd gathered. The blacksmith, the storekeeper, ranchers, their wives, the curious and the fearful. They formed a semicircle, their faces a mixture of confusion and apprehension. They were the jury. Then, Silas Pike and Sheriff Beaumont arrived, pushing their way to the front of the crowd. Pike's hand was bandaged, and his face was a controlled mask of cold fury. Beaumont, his authority restored by Pike's presence, puffed out his chest. "What is the meaning of this circus?" Beaumont bellowed. "This is an unlawful assembly." Eliza stepped forward, holding the miner's logbook. She faced the people, her voice steady and clear, carrying across the silent square. "I called you here because a man has been murdered. My brother, James Hart." A murmur went through the crowd. "And I called you here because you are all being robbed," she continued, her voice rising with passion. "Your water, your land, your futures, they are being stolen by a man who uses paper and ink as his weapons." She pointed to the map. "This is a copy of the deed to my land, the deed Mr. Pike sold me, the deed Sheriff Beaumont stamped as law. It shows my property line here." She traced the line along the creek, with an iron stake marking the corner. Her fingers stopped on the faint stain. "But this map is a lie. Beneath the seal, you can see a smudge. It is old blood. And beneath the surveyor's mark for an iron stake, there was another symbol, a symbol for a stone marker." She then pointed to the seal that City had placed on the ground. "This is that marker. It is a seal, a marker of the Dane. It marked the boundary of their ancestral watering place for generations. My brother, who was an honest surveyor, would have recorded it, but someone moved it. Someone erased the truth and replaced it with a lie." She turned to Thomas. "And this man, Thomas Miller, was a witness. He worked for Mr. Pike. He knew what was happening, and for his knowledge, he was left to die in a collapsed mine, a mine that Silas Pike sealed to hide his crimes." Thomas, his voice weak but clear, told his story. He spoke of the unstable conditions, of James Hart's concerns about the safety of the mine, and of the sudden, deliberate collapse. He spoke of being trapped, of hearing the timbers being erected to seal the entrance, of the long, dark days of hopelessness. Pike laughed, a sound of pure contempt. "A fantastic story. The ravings of a disgruntled worker and a hysterical girl, coached by a savage. Do you believe this nonsense?" He looked out at the crowd, his face radiating confidence. "I am the man bringing the railroad here. I am the man bringing prosperity, jobs, a future. Are you going to throw that away for these lies?" Beaumont stepped forward, his hand on his pistol. "This is slander. And as for you, Miss Hart, I am placing you under arrest for inciting a riot and for criminal conspiracy with a native against the peace and dignity of this territory." The threat hung in the hot, still air. The crowd shifted, their faces uncertain. They were afraid of Beaumont. They were indebted to Pike. The truth was a dangerous thing to stand beside. It was the Reverend Miller who broke the spell. He stepped down from the church doorway to stand beside Eliza. He did not look at Pike or the sheriff. He looked at the people. "The sheriff speaks of the law of the territory," the Reverend said, his voice quiet but resonant. "But there is a higher law, the law of truth, the law of conscience. I do not know what happened in that mine, but I know that this woman and this man have a right to be heard, and we have a duty to listen." A few men in the crowd, a rancher named Peterson and the stoic blacksmith, nodded their agreement. It was a small shift, but it was a shift nonetheless. The foundation of Pike's power, the unquestioning fear of the populace, was beginning to crack. Eliza held up the logbook. "This was my brother's. His last words are in this book." She opened it to the final page, where the ink was smeared by dampness. He lists the men on his crew. He notes the instability of the main tunnel, and his last entry, written the day of the collapse, says this Pike ordered extra timber, not for supports, for a wall. He means to seal something in. She looked directly at Silas Pike. he was not sealing in a vein of copper. Mr. Pike, he was sealing in the men who knew his secrets. The accusation was direct, undeniable. Pike's composure finally shattered. Lies, all of it. She is mad. Am I? Eliza's voice was cold as ice. She turned to the small girl still clinging to her father's side. Emma, when that man took you, up at the mine, what did he say to you? Every eye in the square turned to the child. Emma, her voice small but clear as the church bell itself, looked at Silas Pike and said, "He put his gun on my head. He said he would hurt me if my papa told anyone what he did." It was the final, devastating blow. The word of an innocent child, spoken without malice or guile, cut through the web of lies and threats. It was a truth that every man and woman in that square could understand. A murmur of pure, collective revulsion rippled through the crowd. The jury had reached its verdict. Pike saw it in their faces. He had lost. His power, built on illusion and fear, was evaporating under the harsh glare of the sun. But he was not a man to accept defeat. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to someone at the edge of the crowd. Suddenly, there was a commotion. Two men, the hard-faced strangers from the festival, pushed their way through the throng. They were not townsfolk. They moved with the cold, predatory efficiency of wolves. One of them fired a pistol into the air. Panic erupted. The crowd surged backward. In the chaos, the second man lunged for Emma, snatching her from her father's side. "Nobody follows, or the girl gets it," he yelled, dragging the screaming child with him as he and his partner backed away toward the livery stable and their horses. The courtroom under the sky had ended. The trial of truth had given way to a new and more terrible conflict, one that would be judged not by words and evidence, but by the cold, swift law of the gun. The gunshot that had scattered the crowd was a starting gun. While the people of Esperanza scrambled for cover, their momentary courage shattered by the reality of violence, Eliza and Atsidi moved as one. There was no discussion, no plan, only a shared, instinctual purpose that flowed between them. The two bounty hunters were dragging the screaming Emma toward the livery stable, their path cleared by the panic they had created. Atsidi was already untying his horse from the church rail. He threw Eliza onto her mare's back with a strength that belied his lean frame and swung himself into his own saddle. Pike and Beaumont, for the moment, were secondary. Their power was in the town, in the web of fear and obligation they had woven. The bounty hunters were a different kind of threat, immediate, physical, and fleeing toward the wild country where a child's life would be worth less than the price of a bullet. They spurred their horses. The chase beginning before the dust from the initial panic had even settled. The kidnappers had a head start, galloping hard out of town, heading north into the same broken maze of canyons and mesas where the copper mine lay hidden. They were heading for defensible ground. The pursuit was a grim, silent affair. Atsidi rode with his head low, not just watching the fresh tracks of the two horses ahead, but reading the land itself, anticipating their path, cutting across arroyos and washes to shave precious seconds off their lead. Eliza rode beside him, the heavy logbook tucked securely in her saddlebag, the pistol she had taken from Pike, a cold, unfamiliar weight in her hand. The image of Emma's terrified face was burned into her mind, a fire that consumed her own fear. After an hour of hard riding, the tracks led them into the mouth of a narrow canyon. The walls were sheer cliffs of red rock, rising hundreds of feet to a thin strip of brilliant blue sky. The air was still and hot, the silence broken only by the clatter of their horses' hooves on the stony ground and the faint, almost imperceptible sound of running water. A hidden stream breathing life into the heart of the stone. Atsidi reined in his horse, holding up a hand. "They are in here," he said, his voice a low whisper. "They will be waiting. They have the high ground and the hostage. A direct approach is a death sentence." He dismounted and led his horse into the cover of a cluster of boulders. Eliza followed, her heart pounding a heavy rhythm against her ribs. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice tight. Atsidi's eyes scanned the canyon, not as a man looking at an obstacle, but as a scholar reading a familiar text. He saw the way the wind had carved the rock, the places where sound would echo, the patches of loose shale that would betray a footstep. "We do not fight their battle," he said after a long moment. "We make them fight ours, the battle of the land." He pointed to a massive, oddly shaped boulder on the opposite wall of the canyon. About halfway down, that rock, it is hollow, a wind bell, my people call it. When you strike it, the sound does not come from the rock itself. It echoes from deep inside the canyon. It will sound as if we are behind them. Eliza understood immediately. A diversion, a sound trap. "And you?" he asked, turning his gaze to her. "They will be looking for the source of the sound. They will be looking into the canyon. They will not be looking back at the entrance." Eliza followed his gaze, near the canyon mouth. Grazing peacefully in a patch of sun-cured grass was a small herd of wild mustangs, their coats the color of the red earth. Her mind raced, connecting the pieces of the puzzle he was laying out, a diversion for their ears, and another for their eyes. "My mother gave me a signal mirror," she said, her hand going to her saddlebag, "to use in case of emergencies." A rare, fleeting smile touched Atsidi's lips. "This would qualify," he said. He took a long coil of rope from his saddle and handed her a flat, heavy stone. "Go back to the entrance. Stay hidden. When I make the sound, give me a few moments for them to become confused. Then use the mirror. Flash the sun into the eyes of the lead stallion. A bright, sudden light. It will spook him. The herd will follow. They will stampede past the canyon mouth. Not into it, just past it. It will create a cloud of dust and a wall of noise. In that confusion, we move." Their plan was a delicate piece of clockwork, relying on knowledge, timing, and a healthy measure of luck. They separated, Eliza making her way back to the mouth of the canyon, her heart a wild bird in her chest. Atsidi, moving with a ghost-like silence, began to climb the near wall, making his way toward a point opposite the hollow rock. Eliza found a place behind an outcropping of rock that gave her a clear view of both the mustangs and the canyon entrance. She waited, the sun beating down on her, the silence stretching her nerves to the breaking point. Then it came, a deep, resonant boom that was not the sound of a gunshot. It was a hollow, echoing clang, as if a giant had struck an anvil deep within the earth. The sound rolled down the canyon, seeming to come from everywhere at once. A moment later, a second boom followed. From deep within the canyon, a nervous shout. What was that, followed by a gunshot? The sharp crack echoing wildly. A blind shot fired at a phantom enemy. That was her cue. Eliza pulled out the small, polished mirror. She caught the sun, a brilliant, blinding star of light in her hand. She aimed it carefully, letting the beam dance across the rocks until it found the lead stallion. For a moment, the magnificent animal stood frozen, its head up, its eyes wide. Then she flashed the light directly into its face. The stallion snorted, a sound of pure terror, and bolted. The herd followed instantly. A wave of living, thundering horseflesh. They galloped past the mouth of the canyon, their hooves churning the red earth into a thick, choking cloud. The noise was deafening, a roar that filled the world. Through the swirling dust, Eliza ran, her pistol held ready. She saw Atsidi across the way, a fleeting shadow descending the cliff face. He had timed his movement perfectly with the chaos. Inside the canyon, the two bounty hunters were completely disoriented. They were peering into the dust cloud, their backs to the canyon's interior, their attention fixed on the stampede. Emma was huddled behind a rock, her face streaked with tears and dust. One of the men held a stick of dynamite with a lit fuse. He was about to throw it toward the canyon mouth to block any pursuit. Now a voice shouted, "It was Atsidi!" He dropped from a ledge behind the two men. One of them spun around, firing wildly. Atsidi grunted, a sharp intake of breath, and stumbled as a bullet grazed his arm. But he did not stop. He launched himself at the man holding Emma, tackling him to the ground. At the same time, Eliza saw the second man preparing to throw the dynamite, not at the entrance, but toward the struggle where Atsidi and his partner were now grappling on the ground. He meant to kill them all. Eliza raised her pistol. There was no time to aim for the man. She aimed for the thin, sputtering line of the fuse. She fired. The bullet struck the fuse line, severing it. The dynamite, its fiery tail extinguished, fell harmlessly to the ground. The man stared at it in disbelief, then looked up at Eliza, his face a mask of rage. But the fight was already over. Atsidi had subdued his opponent and was now on his feet, holding the man's own gun against him. Emma, seeing her chance, scrambled away from the fight and ran toward Eliza, throwing her arms around her legs. The rescue was complete. Just as a wave of profound relief washed over Eliza, two more figures appeared at the canyon mouth, their silhouettes dark against the settling dust. It was Silas Pike and Sheriff Beaumont. They had followed the chase, hanging back, letting their hired guns do the dangerous work. Beaumont had his pistol drawn. He took in the scene his two hired men defeated, the girl safe, Eliza holding a gun, his face, already red, turned a deeper shade of purple. All his authority, all his power, had been defied and dismantled by this one woman. "Drop the gun! Hart!" he snarled, his voice shaking with rage. "It is over. You are under arrest." He leveled his pistol, not at Atsidi, but directly at Eliza's heart. This was the end of it. He was the law, and he was about to execute his final judgment. No, a voice cried out. From the dust, a new figure emerged, limping heavily but moving with a desperate urgency. It was Thomas, the miner. He had followed them, driven by a father's desperate need to see his child safe. He saw the sheriff's gun aimed at the woman who had saved him, who had saved his daughter. He did not hesitate. He threw himself in front of Eliza just as Beaumont fired. The gunshot was a flat, ugly sound in the narrow canyon. Thomas cried out, a sound of shock and pain, and collapsed to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest. For a moment, the world stood still. The sight of the sheriff gunning down an unarmed, injured man in cold blood was a line that, once crossed, could never be undone. The spell of fear that had held Esperanza in its grip for so long was finally, irrevocably broken. From the canyon mouth, more figures appeared. It was the blacksmith, the rancher Peterson, and a dozen other men from the town. They had followed Thomas. They had come to see the end of the story. And they had just witnessed the ultimate act of corruption. The blacksmith, his face a grim mask of fury, began to walk slowly toward Beaumont. The sheriff looked at the advancing townsmen, at their hard, unforgiving faces, and for the first time, Eliza saw true fear in his eyes. His power was gone. He was just a man with a gun, and he had just murdered one of their own in front of them all. He backed away, his pistol trembling in his hand. But there was nowhere to go. Silas Pike, ever the strategist, saw that the battle was lost. This was no longer a fight he could win with threats or money. He turned without a word, scrambled onto his horse, and spurred it into a desperate gallop. Not back toward the town he had lost, but toward the distant freight station, his last and only escape route. In the echoing silence that followed the gunshot, the canyon seemed to hold its breath. The raw, brutal act had shocked even the hardened men who had come prepared for a fight. Thomas lay on the ground, a growing red stain on his shirt, his daughter Emma crying at his side. The Reverend Miller rushed to his side, tearing a strip from his own shirt to press against the wound. Sheriff Beaumont stood frozen, the smoking pistol still in his hand, his face a mask of disbelief at what he had just done. The wall of townsmen, led by the blacksmith, advanced on him, their faces granite, their silence more menacing than any shout. Then the sky broke. A single fat drop of rain struck the dusty ground with a sizzle. Another followed, and another. A low rumble of thunder rolled down from the mesas. Within moments, A steady, determined rain began to fall, a phenomenon so rare in that arid land that it felt like a judgment. It washed the dust from the air, darkened the red rocks to a deep, bloody crimson, and began to turn the ground under their feet from powder to slick, sticky mud. The scent of ozone and wet earth, the smell of a world being cleansed, filled the canyon. The change in the weather broke the spell. Atsidi, his own arm bleeding from the earlier graze, was already moving toward the horses. He looked at Eliza, and a whole conversation passed between them without a word. The fight here was over. Beaumont was finished, a snake with its head crushed by its own stupidity. But the serpent's head, Silas Pike, was still at large. The blacksmith and the rancher Peterson reached the sheriff. Beaumont made no move to resist as the blacksmith took the pistol from his nerveless hand. "You will answer for this." "Beaumont," the blacksmith said, his voice a low growl. "You will answer to a proper judge." Eliza knelt beside Thomas. The Reverend looked up at her, his face grim. "The bullet went through. It is bad, but he is a strong man. We will get him back to town." Eliza looked at Emma, who was holding her father's hand, her small face a picture of terror and grief. She felt a surge of cold, clarifying rage. This was Pike's work, all of it. "Atsidi," she called, her voice cutting through the rain. "The freight station." He nodded, already in his saddle. The townsmen, seeing their purpose, mounted their own horses. This was no longer just Eliza's fight. The shooting of Thomas had made it theirs. They were a posse now, born not of law but of outrage, riding to bring a reckoning. The chase to the freight station was a grim, sodden affair. The rain turned the world into a blur of gray and brown. The trail became a treacherous river of mud, sucking at the horses' hooves, slowing their pursuit to a determined, punishing plod. But the same rain that hindered them was also hindering their quarry. They could see Pike ahead, a lone figure struggling against the elements, his horse slipping and sliding on the slick ground. The freight station was a lonely outpost on the edge of the plains, a collection of sidings, a water tower, and a small office. A single, long train stood on the main track, its engine hissing impatiently, steam billowing into the rain-soaked air. It was a freight train, its flat cars laden with stacks of raw lumber and crates stenciled with the word dynamite. It was Pike's escape, loaded with the very tools he had used to build his empire and his tomb. As they approached, they saw Pike frantically arguing with the train's engineer. The engineer, a stout man with a face full of grease and frustration, was shaking his head. Eliza and the posse rode up, forming a silent, dripping semicircle around the scene. Pike spun around, his face a mask of fury when he saw them. He was trapped. "What is the problem? Mr. Pike," Eliza called out, her voice calm despite the rain plastering her hair to her face. "Trouble with your getaway." "My boiler is empty," the engineer shouted, his voice full of righteous anger. "We cannot build steam without water, and the tower pump is busted. This whole operation is a disaster." Pike stared at the silent engine, then at the useless water tower, and then at the sky, from which the water he so desperately needed was now falling in mocking abundance. The irony was so thick it was almost laughable. The man who had tried to steal a creek, who had built his power on controlling the lifeblood of the desert, was defeated by a simple lack of water. He turned to face them, his composure returning, his arrogance a shield against his desperation. "So, you have followed me," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. A mob of farmers led by a hysterical girl. "What do you intend to do, hang me? That is your style, is it not?" Eliza dismounted, her boots sinking into the mud. She walked toward him, not with a gun in her hand, but with the miner's logbook. She held it up. "There will be no hanging," she said, her voice carrying over the drumming of the rain. "There will be no mob justice, but there will be a verdict, an inkless verdict, delivered not by a judge you have purchased, but by the people you have wronged." She stood before the crowd, before the stalled train, a solitary figure delivering a judgment as real and binding as any handed down in a courthouse. "This is the judgment of the people of Esperanza," she declared, her voice ringing with an authority she had not known she possessed. "First, the creek that runs along the north pasture, and the spring that feeds it, will no longer be considered private property. It is the shared lifeblood of this valley. Its use will be governed by a council, with seats for the settlers and for the din, to ensure it is shared fairly by all who depend upon it." A deep, rumbling eye came from the assembled townsmen. It was a sound of profound and unified agreement. "Second," Eliza continued, her gaze fixed on Pike, "the assets of Silas Pike in this territory. His land, his holdings, this train will be seized. From them, compensation will be paid to the family of Thomas Miller and to the families of every man who was lost or injured in the North Mesa copper mine." Again, the crowd roared its approval, a sound of righteous satisfaction. "And third," she said, her voice softening slightly, "the people of Esperanza will elect a new sheriff. We will choose a man who serves the community, not a man who serves the highest bidder." Pike sneered. "You have no authority. This is meaningless." "Our authority comes from the truth," Eliza said, "and from the fact that we are no longer afraid of you." As she spoke, two figures emerged from the shadows of the freight office. It was the two bounty hunters from the canyon. They had circled around, their horses tethered out of sight. They were no longer Pike's employees. They were professionals, and their contract had been voided by their employer's spectacular failure. "Silas Pike," the first one said, his voice flat and businesslike. "There is a federal warrant for your arrest out of Denver for fraud, and I imagine there will be a new one for murder here shortly. You are worth more to us in chains than you are as a patron." They advanced on Pike, handcuffs dangling from one man's hand. Pike looked from them to the unforgiving faces of the townsmen, and he knew it was over. His world of paper promises and paid allegiances had crumbled to dust and mud. The blacksmith and Peterson took charge of Beaumont, tying his hands securely. "We will hold him until the county marshal can get here," the blacksmith said. "He will face a proper trial." The crisis was over. The violence had passed. The rain began to soften, the downpour easing to a gentle, cleansing drizzle. Later that day, after Thomas had been carried back to town and pronounced stable, after Pike was in irons and Beaumont was locked in his own jail cell under the guard of the townsmen, Eliza rode out of town. She was not alone. Atsidi rode beside her. They did not speak. There was nothing that needed to be said. They rode north, back to the mine, back to the dark mouth of the tomb that had held her brother. The air was cool and clean after the rain. The world seemed new, washed clean of its sins. Eliza dismounted and walked to the entrance of the mine. From her satchel, she took the mud-stained handkerchief, the one with the letter H stitched in the corner. She did not weep. The time for that kind of grief had passed. She folded the small square of linen carefully and placed it on a flat rock just beside the entrance, weighing it down with a small stone. It was not a grave marker, but a silent farewell, a wind grave, a recognition that his body was lost to the earth, but his memory was now free. As she stood there, Atsedi came to stand beside her. He knelt, and from a pouch at his belt, he took several small, smooth, river-worn stones. He began to place them on the ground next to her handkerchief. He did not build a cairn, a pile of rocks to mark a spot. He laid them out in a perfect, open circle, a tease, a shape with no beginning and no end. It was a symbol of harmony, of memory, of the great cycle of life and loss that belonged to the land itself. He was not just offering comfort. He was taking her private grief and making it a part of the land's long memory, honoring her brother not with a cross or a cut stone, but with a quiet promise from the earth that he would not be forgotten. Eliza looked at the white square of linen and the gray circle of stones. Side by side, two cultures, two sorrows, two memories, united in a single, silent act of remembrance, a tribute, not of anger or vengeance, but of love and peace. The rain that had started as a judgment ended as a blessing. It fell for a full day, a slow, soaking rain that quenched the thirsty land, filled the creek until it ran clear and strong, and washed the last of the red dust from the air, leaving the world looking new and clean and sharp-edged. In its wake, a quiet but profound change settled over Esperanza. The fear that had been the town's currency for so long was gone, replaced by a fragile but determined sense of shared purpose. The inkless verdict, delivered in the mud of the freight yard, had held. The blacksmith, a man of few words and solid principles, was made the acting sheriff by unanimous consent. Beaumont was held in his own jail, awaiting the arrival of the county marshal, a symbol of a corrupt law now contained by the will of the people. Pike's assets were frozen, his empire of paper and lies dissolving under the clear light of his public crimes. And Thomas, the miner who had thrown himself in front of a bullet for the woman who had saved his child, was slowly, miraculously, beginning to heal, his survival a testament to the town's newfound solidarity. A week after the confrontation in the canyon, a gathering was held by the banks of the newly flowing creek. It was not a celebration, but a ceremony, an act of solemn and necessary creation. On one side of the water stood the people of Esperanza, the Reverend Miller, the blacksmith, the Peterson family, and the other settlers who had chosen to stand for the truth. On the other side stood a delegation of the Dean, their elders dressed in traditional woven blankets, their faces carved with the wisdom of generations. Atsidi stood among them, not as a leader, but as a bridge between the two worlds. In the center, on a simple wooden table, lay a new document. It was not a deed or a contract of sale. It was an agreement, a pact of shared stewardship. The Reverend Miller read it aloud in English, his voice clear and steady in the quiet afternoon. The document declared the creek and the spring that fed it to be a common resource, its health and preservation the shared responsibility of all who lived in the valley. It established a water council, with members from both the town and the tribe, to ensure its waters were used wisely and distributed fairly, for the good of all. When he was finished, one of the Dine elders stepped forward and spoke the same words in his own tongue, his voice a low, melodious chant that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It was a language of harmony and balance, a verbal map of the sacred responsibilities that tied the people to the land. Then came the most important part of the ceremony. There was no signing of names, no pressing of wax seals. Instead, the blacksmith and a young settler carried one of the heavy, triangular stones of the seal to the place where the fourth survey marker should have been. Atsidi and another Navajo man carried the second stone, and two of the elders carried the third. Together, under the watchful eyes of both communities, they rebuilt the ancient marker. They placed the stones one on top of the other, their hands, calloused and dark, brown and pale, working together to restore the promise that had been broken. It was an act of profound and simple power, a physical manifestation of their new, shared law. The truth of the land was being honored once more. That night, a soft, gentle rain began to fall again, a final, quiet blessing on the newly healed land. Eliza stood on the porch of the small cabin she was now building on her property. The property that was truly hers not by a stamped deed, but by the respect she had earned. She watched the raindrops catch the light from her lantern, each one a tiny, fleeting jewel. She was not alone. Atsidi stood with her, leaning against one of the porch posts, the silence between them as comfortable and deep as the night sky. The wound on his arm was healing, a clean, sharp line that would one day be a scar, a reminder of the battle they had fought and won. "It is a good sound," she said, her voice soft. "The rain." "It is the sound of the land drinking," he replied, his voice a low murmur. "It is happy." She turned to him, a playful, tired smile on her lips. The weight she had carried for so long, the burden of her lost brother and her uncertain future, had finally begun to lift. In its place was a quiet, hopeful peace. "We have made a great many new laws this week," she said, her eyes glinting in the lamplight. "The Water Council, the new sheriff, the compensation fund." She took a step closer to him. "I was just wondering, is there a clause in this new law of ours about a woman's right to kiss the man who saved her life?" Atsidi looked at her, and in the soft light, she could see the warmth in his eyes, the hint of a smile that touched the corners of his mouth. He pushed himself away from the post and came to stand before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "The law of the sky," he said, his voice so quiet it was almost lost in the sound of the rain, "was here long before ours." He lowered his head and touched his lips to hers. It was a kiss as gentle as the falling rain, a quiet affirmation that needed no grand pronouncements. It was not the claiming of a prize or the culmination of a fevered passion. It was the simple, profound meeting of two souls who had walked through fire together and had found a place of peace on the other side. It was a promise, older and more binding than any written on paper. A few weeks later, life in Esperanza had found its new rhythm. The town was quieter, perhaps, but more solid. The frantic, grasping energy of Pike's ambition had been replaced by a slower, more deliberate pace of cooperative building. The water from the creek was shared, the new sheriff was fair, and people looked at each other with a newfound respect born of shared struggle. Eliza was walking down the main street with Atsidi, their hands loosely clasped, when a group of children, including a healthy and laughing Emma, ran past them. One of the boys, seeing them, stopped and yelled out in a teasing, sing-song voice, "Look, Miss Eliza, I heard there are 13 new men lined up to ask you for a dance." His friends giggled, a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. The story of the Harvest Festival had already become a part of the town's mythology, a tale to be told on long winter nights. What had been an act of public humiliation was now a source of local pride, a symbol of the moment their town had begun to change. Eliza smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. She looked at Atsidi, whose eyes were crinkling with amusement. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, and together they simply walked on, past the laughing children, past the memory of the 13 suitors, their path their own, chosen not from a line of waiting men, but from a world of infinite possibility. She had learned that freedom was not about the land you owned, but about the right to choose the hand you held. She had come to this harsh, beautiful country seeking a new life, and had found it not in a piece of paper, but in the eyes of a man who understood the law of the sky, and in the quiet strength of a community that had learned, finally, how to share its water and its future. Thank you for listening to our story. We invite you to let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please remember to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.